We have Gopal Balachandran, Chief Financial Officer at ICICI Lombard, joining us. Mr. Balachandran, great having you. Let me start off with trying to understand the combined ratio. It's deteriorated meaningfully this quarter. Beyond the one-off impact of the Supreme Court provision and the two large fire claims, what were the key underlying factors that put pressure on underwriting margins?
From an ICICI Lombard standpoint, I think the thought process of continuing to write profitable growth and therefore appropriate risk selection as a philosophy is something that continues to remain intact. There is absolute no change in the thought process of how we want to kind of look at writing risks, even historically and even for the way forward. And therefore, when you put that in context, I think what we are seeing insofar as the business momentum is concerned, I think we are seeing a very, very positive trend overall insofar as the economic activities and therefore the impact on ground. And to that extent, that significantly augurs positive both for the industry and more importantly for ICICI Lombard in general. And that's how the quarter is also kind of largely reflective of. I think when you look at the core or let's say the base business model, I think that pretty much remains intact. Exactly to your point on some of the events that have kind of obviously come in this quarter, I think rightly mentioned on both the judgment of the Honorable Supreme Court of India and of course we did have a couple of large losses in the fire segment. And that's the reason why we specifically put both of them in terms of the impact that it had on the combined ratios. On the judgment alone, I think at this point of time, this is the prudent and conservative estimate that we have put across. That had an impact on the combined of roughly about 2.8%. And the impact of the two large losses on the combined was roughly at about 1%. And when you kind of take this out, and as we keep saying that you have to keep looking at combined on an N basis, the combined ratios is pretty much in line with what we have been speaking even in the past, as in to say that quarter one of last year was at a combined of 102.2%, excluding a couple of these events, which also has kind of industry impacting elements. For us, the combined would have been 102.3%. So in that sense, I think a very, very satisfying quarter. I think when we look at it on an overall basis, I think of course these are some of the events that have happened during the period.
Right. And is the 165 crore rupee reserve strengthening sufficient based on current estimates, or could there be further reserve additions as claims experience evolves?
So again, a good question to ask. I think just to reiterate, I think this is a judgment that came in the month of June, and so hence to that extent, I think it's a recent one. And that's the reason one kind of called out to say that what we have done at this point of time is we have tried to see what is it that could preliminarily have an impact insofar as the overall industry loss ratio outcomes are concerned. So that's one. And secondly, therefore, when you look at it from an ICICI Lombard standpoint, I think the judgments of the courts on the third party portfolio is something that is inherent as a part of the business that we do. And this is not the first time that we have seen judgments coming and impacting the book. Even historically, at several points of time, way back in, for example, 2008, we had a judgment. We had a judgment in 2017. We had a couple of judgments in the financial year 2021. So even at each of those points, and more specifically since the time we got listed post 2017, in 2021, when a similar kind of a judgment had come through, following an approach of prudence and conservatism in our claim reserving thought process, I think we have continued to follow the same. The fact that there's a judgment that came in Q1, it was rightful on our part to kind of do an assessment and see what does it do insofar as the need for any claim reserving. Considering a holistic assessment of the past book as well as the book that we have till 30th of June, as I said, we have again put a prudent and a conservative estimate. And on that basis, I think the reserve addition that we have kind of taken is about 165 crores. So hence, we will obviously see, as I said, there's a lot of factors that are variable. How each of them play out is something that will determine the adequacy or inadequacy of it. Having said that, when you see the reserving triangle disclosures, which is now a public information for pretty much every player in the market, whether they are listed or otherwise, ICICI Lombard on its motor third-party portfolio has been consistently depicting a small amount of reserve releases. So that clearly speaks of the adequacy and the strength of reserves that we have. And hence, to that extent, I think, as I said, we have been absolutely prudent and conservative in the estimates of 165 crores.
Gopal, can you also provide some color on the two large fires which led to increase in combined ratio? Were these isolated incidents, or do they reflect increasing risk within the commercial property portfolio?
The only reason for us to call out is, for us, I think, as we keep saying, we are in the business of risk, and therefore, to that extent, losses are pretty much a part and parcel of the process in terms of what we do. Having said that, if there are any risk events which has a relatively higher proportion in terms of its possible impact on a given period, then to that extent is the only reason why we have called it out separately. So hence, both of these large losses on the fire portfolio has had an impact, as I said, on the combined ratios by about 1%. And inherently, and that is also, which was one of the questions that one had asked, if one were to have excluded these two large losses, what would have been the outcome of the fire loss ratios, which currently is at almost about 118%. If you go back to history, ICICI Lombard has never delivered a combined ratio on fire at such a magnitude. When you look at long-term averages, our fire portfolio loss ratio has generally ranged between 65 to 70%, has been very, very profitable. And therefore, to that extent, insofar as that's the reason why I said on the thought process of risk selection, I don't think there is any fundamental challenges. I think that's the nature of the business that we are in. And therefore, to that extent, these two events happened in this quarter. And hence, we have kind of called it out separately. But otherwise, no fundamental challenges in the way we are kind of underwriting that segment. And the good news is, I think the relative competitive intensity that we had seen on April 1 being the largest time cycle for renewal of fire policies. When you look at in the month of June, the extent of degrowth that the industry has experienced has kind of seen a come off. So that's very, very positive. And even for ICICI Lombard, in that context, when you see the month of June, I think we have been better than the market.
Okay, and fire insurance pricing has remained competitive, is what you suggested on the con call. Are you seeing early signs of pricing discipline returning? Does competitive intensity continue to weigh? How should one look at margins? Give us a sense.
Again, let me put this in context, which is what I kind of talked about. I think our thought process of writing any risk, whether it is retail lines or whether it is commercial lines, I think the philosophy remains the same. I think, and more importantly, on the commercial lines, there is an additional stakeholder to whom we are equally accountable for, which are the reinsurers. They are equally providers of capital because these are relatively large exposures. And therefore, we do tend to kind of reinsure a portion of the risk that we underwrite. So therefore, there's an added responsibility on us as primary insurers of the risk. And in that context, when you look at ICICI Lombard over years, particularly on the commercial lines and more importantly, the fire segment of business, what we have been able to exhibit as an outcome has been a very, very profitable outcome insofar as writing that segment is concerned. And that's the reason why time and again, in most of our earnings call, we keep coming back and saying that the terms that we have been able to get from our insurers have been a very, very positive one. So hence, to that extent, absolute sense of discipline is what we kind of exhibit, particularly to writing some of these large exposures. And that's the reason why we have seen an outcome which has been favorable for ICICI Lombard. Specifically in the context of how the market is kind of responding to, and that's the reason why I called out. If you look at Q1, the industry degrowth for fire was roughly about 27%, against which ICICI Lombard's degrowth was almost about 32%. But when you look at the month of June, ICICI Lombard, the industry degrowth has kind of slightly come off. It is now at about 22% as against 27% for Q1. And for us, against the 32% degrowth that we had a degrowth of about 18%. So it is actually better than the market for the month of June. And therefore, the momentum on ground, I think, is looking very, very positive. And that's exactly opportunities which we look forward to underwrite from an ICICI Lombard standpoint.
Right. And following these losses, are you making any changes to underwriting standards, risk selection in the fire portfolio?
Think again, before I answer specific on that, I think particularly on the fire portfolios, what we have been exhibiting is a lot of value-added services initiative insofar as working with corporates are concerned. Because fundamentally, our business is there are two ways to look at what we do. One is we can be simply be a transferer of risk of a corporate, as in corporate can place their insurances with us, which is nothing but a risk transfer practice. The second is, can we do a lot more value add for a corporate to try and see if that corporate can possibly take steps, initiatives to possibly try and minimize instances of risk events. So on value added services, that's an initiative that we instituted way back in 2014. And we work with a lot of corporates to kind of work with them and see how, in the event there have been loss events or risk events, how over the longer term they can possibly make various interventions and in the process possibly try and minimize some of these losses or some of these risk events. So that's exactly what we will work with the commercial corporates in general. And we have clearly seen huge positives play out in terms of the experience that we have seen subsequent to the value added services initiative. And more importantly, given that we are also doing this particular service, the extent of customer retention in terms of the number of corporates who tend to kind of stay on with ICICI Lombard is a very high number. So it helps us on the dual front, and that is exactly what we will continue to exhibit even when we look at in the current context.
Right. Great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for your time then.